Hi everyone, and welcome to Truth Over News. Many people's eyes were opened during the pandemic to just how easily the public can be manipulated to go along with the most outrageous and ridiculous rules. This Venn diagram puts what we all saw in a psychological context. The public's response during COVID closely mirrors psychological experiments going back many decades. In other words, large parts of the public behaved exactly as predicted in completely irrational ways, and the government knew that they would. The three most famous psychological experiments are the Asch, Milgram, and Stanford Prison experiments. They deal with conformity, peer pressure, and submission to authority, and COVID rolled all of them into one. In today's show, we're going to look at these experiments, ask why people behave irrationally, and how governments abuse those human propensities. The Asch experiment from the 1950s is probably the most famous human psychology experiment. The experiment itself is really simple. A group of people were asked which line on the right of the image corresponds in length to the one on the left. Well, that's obviously line C, you might say. But when the experiment was carried out, it became clear that people's answers do not depend as much on the actual length of the line, but on what other people say. Assuming no one else is around, everyone would likely say line C. But psychologist Solomon Asch wanted to test what effect other people's opinions would have on the answer. And to accomplish this, Asch hired a group of actors, put them in the same room as one non-actor, and instructed the actors to intentionally provide incorrect answers. In this case, that would be either answer A or B. And then also in the room was one non-actor who could freely choose between A, B, or C. The non-actor thought they were part of a genuine experiment to test people's perceptions of lengths. They did not know that the other people in the room were actors. All that the non-actor had to do was truthfully answer which lines matched. Sounds easy, right? Well, the results were absolutely shocking and go right to the heart of human psychology. In the first and second round of questions, the actors provided correct answers to make everything look normal. But then they started giving wrong answers, and this caused the non-actor to start doubting themselves. By round 3 or 4, the non-actor started agreeing with whatever the group said, even if the answer was obviously wrong. In fact, 75% of non-actor participants started giving wrong answers just because everyone else was giving wrong answers. What Asch showed us is that human beings are hardwired towards conformity. Conformity trumps truth. And governments made full use of that during COVID. Knowing that most people would naturally pivot toward conformity, public health authorities put out dishonest narratives to establish control over people, such as the narrative that COVID was far more dangerous than it actually was, or that lockdowns save lives, or that masks work, or that vaccines are safe and effective, and of course that the virus came from nature. Most people simply told the line, even if their own eyes and good sense were saying otherwise. For instance, anyone could see that lockdowns did not work, or else they wouldn't need to have been extended all the time, or that people with masks or vaccines still got sick all the time. And the lessons learned from the Asch experiment also tie in with why there was such a massive crackdown on dissent, for instance, through social media censorship. When you seek conformity, you cannot have dissent, because the more dissent you get, the more likely natural conformists will switch sides. Imagine the Asch experiment where there is more than one person who is a non-actor and has a free choice. As soon as there are at least 2 non-actors in the room, they will reassure each other and be far more likely to stick to the correct answer. In Asch, there were only a few people in the room, so 2 nonconformists could break the trend. But if we scale that to 330 million, you'll need a lot more nonconformists to break through the false narratives. And that's what was missing during COVID. There were far too few people who spoke up. In ASH, only 1 in 4 people believed their eyes. We suspect in COVID it was even lower than that. The second of the 3 famous psychological experiments, which was also completely validated by people's behavior during COVID, is the Milgram experiment. The Milgram experiment is a 1960s experiment in which psychologist Stanley Milgram tested people's propensity to obey authority, even if it meant physically hurting other people. The setup was pretty easy. Milgram advertised for recruits in what he said was a study of memory and learning. Participants would be paid for their time. Participants were given the role of teacher and told to sit at a machine that dispensed electric shocks. The shocks would be given to another person who was called the learner, who was actually an actor. A third person, called the experimenter, was also an actor. The experimenter would ask the learner a series of questions. Participants did not know that the experimenter or learner were actors. They thought this was a genuine experiment about memory and learning. Participants were instructed to press a button and give electric shocks to the learner every time that the learner gave a wrong answer. To make sure the participant wouldn't know that the electric shocks were fake, a screen was set up between the participant and the learner. A tape recorder would then play sounds of someone moaning and crying each time a shock was dispensed. As the shocks grew more intense, the sounds would become more intense, all the way to the learner screaming and crying about having a heart condition. Just as with the ASH experiment, the results were shocking. Despite the crying and screaming, a high proportion of participants kept administering shocks even when it was obvious that they were causing tremendous pain. In other words, they obeyed the orders from the experimenter irrespective of how that affected the learner. A staggering 65% of participants fully obeyed. We're all taught, or perhaps we should say conditioned, from an early age to obey parents, teachers, the police, and so on. But things took on a whole new dimension during COVID. Police arrested people for surfboarding, for going to parks, for having barbecues. States ordered supermarkets to close off aisles they deemed to contain non-essential goods. Churches were shut. People were fined for attending drive-through church services where absolutely no one was at risk of anything. Pastors were arrested. And throughout it all, hardly anyone made a peep. Hairdressers, restaurant owners, tattooists, and all kinds of other people were all arrested. People were fined for not wearing masks. We could go on and on. Of course, most people just obeyed without the threat of arrest. And it's not just ordinary people who just obeyed. It's also the fact that the police departments thought it was okay to arrest churchgoers. Everyone simply obeyed. Just following orders, they claimed. What happened during COVID was a complete validation of what Milgram had postulated all those decades ago. And once again, governments used this human psychological tendency to great effect. They knew that no matter how ridiculous the rule, people would just obey, and the police would just enforce. The third of the big 3 psychological experiments is the Stanford Prison Experiment. That was a 1970s experiment by psychologist Philip Zimbardo at Stanford University. The experiment aimed to explore people's behaviors in a simulated prison environment. Zimbardo set up a simulated prison in the basement of the psychology building at Stanford University. Participants were recruited for the experiment and then randomly assigned as either guards or prisoners. The guards were provided uniforms and tasked with maintaining order in the prison, while the prisoners were given uniforms and instructed to abide by the rules. Even though all participants knew that this was just a psychological experiment of prison life, their behavior was absolutely shocking. As the days went by, guards started behaving authoritatively and sometimes even abusively. The prisoners became passive and obedient, although some rebelled. These patterns escalated with each passing day, with guards especially becoming more and more abusive. The experiment was intended to run for 2 weeks, which all participants knew ahead of time. But things got so out of hand in terms of increasing cruelty that Stanford was forced to end the experiment after just 6 days. The Stanford Prison Experiment shows how social roles and situations can impact human behavior. Ordinary individuals started adopting behaviors linked to their assigned roles, even if those behaviors were harmful, and even if, as in this case, they knew that they were part of an experiment. We saw exactly those same patterns emerge during COVID, which was in many ways a worldwide version of the Stanford Prison Experiment. Just like in the Stanford Experiment, we saw the psychological effects of perceived roles and perceived power during COVID. People who saw themselves in those roles, public health officials, governors, mayors, police, and so on, were the prison guards. Many became little dictators, absolutely relishing the fact that they suddenly had all this power over what other people could or could not do. And almost everyone in the general public accepted their role as prisoners. They accepted the restrictions and the psychological abuses. The same thing happened with mandating masks, mandating the so-called vaccines, and even forcing them on children, despite the total absence of any long-term studies. People like Fauci were the guards, and everyone else was the prisoner. And once again, the government knew exactly how things would play out. After all, these 3 experiments have been around for 50, 60, and 70 years. Perhaps the only surprising aspect is how incredibly prescient these experiments proved to be. Authorities knew there was a huge likelihood that almost everyone would comply with even the most ridiculous COVID rules. But the people who pushed this nonsense were probably surprised by how far-reaching the compliance actually was. Just think of all the abuses, the closed parks, the shut down churches, the ruined businesses, and yet hardly anyone batted an eyelid. Now, to be fair, some people did bat an eyelid, and this is the other side of the story, and the 3 experiments tell that side of the story as well. While 3 out of 4 people started conforming in the Asch experiment, 1 out of 4 did not. While 65% of participants fully obeyed orders in the Milgram experiment, 35% did not fully comply. While most prisoners in the Stanford experiment became submissive, some people rebelled. And so it was with COVID. When lockdown started on March 16, 2020, we noticed that while almost everyone was cheerleading, a very small group of people were not. There weren't many, but there were some. Another interesting aspect that the 3 experiments predicted was that people would not get tired of lockdowns so long as authority figures said so. Where authority figures said otherwise and opened up, like in the case of Florida, it was suddenly okay to be non-conformist, and so people became that way. But in states that remained closed, the psychological disposition was to be conformist, and so most people just remained that way. That's how we ended up with such a huge contrast between open states, where people wanted things to be open, and closed states, where people wanted things to remain closed. In the political arena, there was exactly one person who saw through all of this from day one. That was Kentucky Congressman Thomas Massie. This is not an endorsement of Thomas Massie, just an acknowledgement of how much grit and guts it takes to go against the flow, and how few people were able to do it. Exactly what the Asch experiment predicted. On the day lockdowns were announced, Massie immediately called out the folly of what was being done. For his efforts, he was chastised by the media. He was the only one out of 535 members of Congress to speak up, and he was the only one who got it right. Just as the experiments predicted, few people would stand up against irrational rules, so long as certain factors were present: conformity, obeisance, and fulfilling perceived roles. But there will be some who will not comply. The question is, what distinguishes them and how can we grow their numbers? Some people are just inherently more independent and less likely to obey authority. But we think that there is an opportunity to expand that group by making more people aware of the underlying psychological tendencies, specifically the fact that most people are hardwired to do irrational things in certain circumstances. Every school and university curriculum should include these experiments as foundational learning. By being aware of these psychological phenomena, people might be more inclined to stick with the truth, ask questions, and not automatically assume that they have to do something just because everyone else is doing it. Thanks for joining us in today's episode of Truth Over News.